There is a pain that doesn't bleed, a prison without visible bars. It is the prison of the mind. And there are artists who become beacons in the darkness, not by showing the light, but by describing the darkness with a precision that sends shivers down our spine. They give us a voice when ours fails. But what happens when the voice that saved millions cannot save itself? Today, here on The Truth, Dark Psychology, we won't talk about the end, but about the silent mechanisms that led to it. The story of one of rock's most iconic voices is a tragic manual on how childhood trauma can manipulate an entire life. If you connect with deep narratives and analyses that go beyond the surface, subscribe and like this video, because we are about to unravel the echoes of a silent goodbye. A child's mind is like wet cement. Any mark, no matter how small, can solidify and define the structure for the rest of their life. In Chester Bennington's case, childhood didn't just leave marks, but true open fractures in his psyche. The sexual abuse he suffered from the age of 7 to 13 was not just an event. It was the programming of self-destruction software. Psychologically, a trauma of this magnitude teaches perverse lessons: that your body is not your own, that your voice has no power, and that the world is a fundamentally unsafe place. This becomes the fundamental truth upon which all other perceptions are built. The charisma on stage, the explosive energy, all of it can be seen as a desperate attempt to rewrite this truth, to prove to himself that he had control, that his voice mattered. This duality between the silent victim and the loud icon is fertile ground for dark psychology. The initial trauma created an other self, a shadow with which he battled his entire life. This other was the personification of pain, shame, and hatred. The lyrics of songs like Crawling were not just metaphors. They were literal descriptions of an internal war. The audience saw art, but he lived the conflict. The manipulation here is not external, but internal. The trauma becomes the manipulator, dictating behavioral patterns, sabotaging relationships, and demanding an ever higher price to be silenced, usually through substances that promise temporary relief but in reality only fed the beast. Chester's genius lay in his ability to translate this internal battle into a universal language. He took the architecture of his own pain and transformed it into anthems for a generation of misfits. However, this process has a devastating cost. By constantly revisiting the source of his pain to create, he kept himself chained to it. It is the paradox of the tortured artist. The same source that fuels his art is the one that consumes his life. The inspiration he offered the world was a byproduct of his own disintegration, an echo of screams he couldn't utter outside of studios and stages. The divorce of his parents at age 11 added another layer of instability, solidifying the belief of abandonment and inadequacy. For a mind already fractured by abuse, the dissolution of the family nucleus acts as a secondary earthquake, demolishing the few remaining structures of safety. The young Chester learned in the most brutal way that he could not trust others for his protection, not even himself. This chronic distrust is a survival tactic that in adult life transforms into isolation even when surrounded by millions of fans. The crowd adored him, but the abused boy inside felt fundamentally alone. Understanding this foundation is crucial. We are not talking about simple sadness or melancholy, but about a complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that governed his life. Every success, every applause, was filtered through this lens of trauma. The fear that everything would fall apart, the feeling of being a fraud who would eventually be exposed, are classic symptoms. He wasn't just singing about pain. He was desperately trying to purge it from his system, without realizing that the very act of singing kept him painfully aware of it. The foundation of his mind was a minefield, and he spent his entire life trying to walk through it without setting off the next bomb. Chester Bennington's charisma was not that of an unreachable, arrogant rock god. On the contrary, his power of Attraction came from a place of radical vulnerability. He placed himself on stage not as a hero, but as one of us, a fellow sufferer. This is an incredibly powerful form of mass manipulation, even if unintentional. By openly exposing his wounds, he gave permission for millions of people to acknowledge their own. He created a safe space for pain, and people connected not just with the music, but with the emotional validation he offered. This connection is tribal, deep, and extremely strong. Psychologically, this is known as projective identification. Fans projected their own anguish, fears, and feelings of inadequacy onto the figure of Chester, and he, in turn, absorbed them and returned them in the form of cathartic art. He became a vessel for the pain of a generation. The inherent risk in this role is the loss of oneself. When your identity merges with the collective suffering, where does the fan's pain end and yours begin? This line became dangerously blurred, turning his career into a continuous performance of martyrdom, where each show was a form of public self-flagellation and at the same time, collective healing. The control he exerted over the audience was absolute, but it didn't come from authority, but from empathy. A scream from him was not just a vocal feat. It was a scream that echoed the silent frustration of every person in the crowd. This sharing of pain creates a bond of loyalty that transcends entertainment. People didn't go to a Linkin Park concert just to have fun. They went to feel understood, on an almost spiritual level. However, being the emotional catalyst for so many is an immense psychological burden. It requires you to stay in constant contact with your own darkness to be authentic, which prevents complete healing. This dynamic between inspiration and self-destruction is the core of the issue. Chester inspired people to keep fighting, but the fuel for that inspiration was his own losing battle. He sang about breaking the habit, but the habit of channeling pain was the essence of his art and his connection with the public. Breaking that habit could mean losing his relevance, his identity as an artist. It's a cruel psychological trap. To save others, he needed to remain in the hell he described so vividly, because that's where his authenticity emanated from. The price of this empathetic genius was loneliness at the top. Even surrounded by his band, family, and fans, the role of the martyr is a solitary one. No one could fully understand the weight of being the mirror for the pain of so many. People saw the reflection of themselves in him, but few could see the man behind the reflection, struggling not to drown in the sea of emotions he himself stirred up. Chester's charisma was genuine, but it was a charisma forged in the fire of trauma, and that fire eventually consumes everything it touches. Chester Bennington's voice was a double-edged sword. To the world, it was an instrument of power, catharsis, and beauty. For him, it became a gilded cage. The same voice that freed him from obscurity and gave him purpose also chained him to a specific persona and pain. The overwhelming success of Hybrid Theory and Meteora solidified an expectation. Linkin Park was the band of angst, and Chester was the spokesman for the tormented. Any deviation from this formula was met with resistance, as seen in the reaction of some fans to the album, One More Light. This pressure forced him to inhabit a mental space from which he was desperately trying to escape. The psychology of performance explains how an artist can merge with their role. For Chester, the stage was not just a workplace. It was where his identity was most validated and, paradoxically, most imprisoned. He needed to access the pain to deliver the performance everyone expected. This means reopening wounds night after night, city after city. It's a cycle of self-imposed re-traumatization, disguised as art. The audience's applause, while gratifying, acted as positive reinforcement for this self-destructive behavior, teaching his brain that the path to love and acceptance was through the display of his suffering. Asterisk. This dynamic creates a subtle form of external control. The expectations of the market, the record label, and the fans act as invisible walls, limiting artistic and personal freedom. The attempt to evolve musically in One More Light was in essence an attempt to evolve psychologically. It was a request for permission to be something other than the sad, angry kid. The mixed reception to this work may have been interpreted by his already fragile psyche as a rejection not just of the music, but of himself, of his attempt to heal. If the world only loved him when he was suffering, what incentive was there to get better? The concept of captive identity is relevant here. Chester became a captive of the image he himself helped create. He was a genius at articulating pain, but that genius became his sentence. He gave the world a vocabulary for depression and anxiety, but in doing so, he depleted his own lexicon for happiness and peace. His own voice, the tool of his salvation, became the constant reminder of his damnation. Every interview where he was asked about the darkness of his lyrics, every request to sing Crawling for the 1000th time, was another nail in his psychological cell. In the end, the art that was supposed to be liberating became the prison itself. He built a masterpiece that perfectly described the contours of his cage, but in doing so, he only reinforced its bars. The audience admired the beauty and complexity of the prison, without fully realizing the cost to the prisoner. The greatest irony and tragedy of Chester Bennington's life is that the voice that made him immortal was the same one that kept him from living. He taught us about pain like no one else, but in the process, he forgot how to teach himself to break free from it. Human connection is a two-way street, and emotions are contagious, especially the darkest ones. The suicide of his close friend, Chris Cornell, 2 months before his own death, cannot be seen as an isolated event, but as a devastating trigger in a mind already on the edge. For Chester, Cornell was not just a friend. He was a mentor, a fellow, survivor of a world with similar pressures, someone he admired and identified with. Cornell's death was not just the loss of a friend. It was the shattering of a mirror of hope. If Cornell, with his strength and talent, couldn't win, what hope was left for him? This phenomenon, known as suicide contagion or the Werther effect, is a well-documented psychological risk. When a vulnerable person is exposed to the suicide of someone they admire or identify with, the act can become a validated option in their mind. Cornell's suicide may have broken a mental barrier for Chester, turning the unthinkable into a tangible possibility. It was the personification of his greatest fear, proof that the demons they both faced could, in fact, win in the end. The pain of grief, mixed with the terror of identification, created a lethal psychological cocktail. Chester's performance of Hallelujah at Cornell's funeral was more than a tribute. It was a glimpse into his own fractured soul. The rawness of his voice, the visible weight on his shoulders, was not just mourning. It was a farewell to a part of himself. He wasn't just singing for his friend. He was singing for his own lost hope. That moment was an act of extreme emotional control in public, trying to maintain composure while inside, the foundations of his psychological world were crumbling. It was a demonstration of the price he paid to keep the mask on, even in the midst of his greatest personal pain. Dark psychology manifests here in how loss can manipulate one's perception of reality. The grief for Cornell, added to his own chronic depression, likely distorted his thinking, reinforcing beliefs of hopelessness and inevitability. If he couldn't make it, I won't be able to either. This type of catastrophic thinking is a central symptom of severe depression. The friend's death was not just a sad event. It was a piece of evidence that his sick mind used to build a case for self-destruction, a final argument that the fight was ultimately futile. The weight of survival is also a factor. Chester, who had been so open about his struggles, now carried not only his own demons but also the echo of Cornell's. He unwillingly became a standard-bearer for the mental health struggle in rock after his friend's death. This added pressure to be an exemplary survivor may have been unbearable. It was another role to play, another expectation to meet. at a time when he could barely support himself. Cornell's shadow didn't just sadden him. It haunted him with a terrifying question he could no longer answer. We're halfway through our analysis. If Chester's story and the way psychology shapes our lives resonates with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to The Truth, Dark Psychology. Your interaction helps us continue to create thought-provoking content. And comment below what other complex personality you'd like to see analyzed on our channel. Now let's continue. One of the most insidious tactics the traumatized mind uses is the desperate search for control amidst internal chaos. For Chester, the search manifested in a classic way, through the abuse of alcohol and drugs. From a dark psychology perspective, addiction is not just a disease, it is a power strategy. When you feel powerless against your own emotions and memories, the ability to chemically alter your state of consciousness seems like a way to regain control. I can't stop the pain, but I can choose not to feel it for a few hours. This is the Faustian bargain the addict makes. The tragic irony is that this search for control leads to a total loss of it. Addiction becomes another master, another manipulator. In his life, Chester's battle with addiction was public and arduous. He spoke openly about his sobriety and his relapses, describing himself as two people, the sober Chester and the destructive other guy. This splitting of the personality is a common defense mechanism in people with a history of trauma. It's a way of compartmentalizing destructive behavior, separating it from the good identity. In order to live with oneself. Self-sabotage is the logical consequence of this dynamic. In moments of success and stability, the traumatized mind can feel uncomfortable, as peace is an unknown and therefore untrustworthy state. Chaos, on the other hand, is familiar. Self-sabotage, whether through a relapse or other destructive behavior, is a way to return to the normal state of crisis. It's the mind unconsciously saying, happiness is temporary and dangerous. Pain is constant and safe. Chester described how, in moments when everything seemed fine, his mind would find a way to create problems, to pile on unnecessary things. This pattern reveals a dark truth about recovery. It's not enough to remove the substance. You have to reprogram the underlying need for chaos. Sobriety for Chester was not the end of the battle. It was just a change of battlefield. Without the chemical crutch, he came face to face with the original pain, raw and unfiltered. This explains why, even in periods of apparent stability, the risk remained so high. The monster didn't die with sobriety. It just fell silent, waiting for a moment of weakness to attack. The psychological lesson here is profound. The control we seek in addictive behaviors is a mirage. True power is not in silencing the pain, but in learning to listen to it without letting it destroy us. Chester fought bravely to achieve this power, but the foundations of his psyche, late in childhood, were too unstable. The illusion of control that drugs offered was a dangerous comfort, a lullaby that soothed him as it led him to the edge of the abyss. One of the most terrifying and deceptive facets of severe depression is the sufferer's ability to project an image of total normalcy or even happiness. The video his wife, Talinda, shared, showing Chester laughing and having fun with his family just 36 hours before his death, is a masterclass on the concept of smiling depression. This is perhaps the most dangerous form of psychological manipulation, not directed at others, but at oneself and consequently, at the world. It is the final act of control, hiding the inner storm behind a calm and sunny facade. This mask is not necessarily an attempt to deceive others, but a complex survival mechanism. For someone with such intense internal pain, admitting the depth of their suffering can feel like an unbearable burden to their loved ones. The mask is a way to protect them, to avoid being a worry. Furthermore, it's a reflection of social stigma. Even for someone as open as Chester, there might be a part that still believes depression is a weakness, And the mask is a desperate attempt to appear strong, to beat the illness through performance. The risk of this facade is absolute. Isolation. By hiding their pain, the person prevents themselves from receiving the help they need precisely when they need it most. Talinda Bennington stated that while warning signs had been present over the years, the period immediately preceding his death was one where the family felt safest, as he seemed to be at his best. This is psychologically devastating, as it shows that, in the end, the decision to leave had already been made, and what they were seeing was not recovery, but the calm that comes with resignation. The fight was over, and he was saying goodbye. In silence, this final performance of normalcy requires an immense amount of mental energy. It is the psychological equivalent of a marathon runner who, in the final miles, decides to smile and wave at the crowd while their muscles are tearing. Chester's mind, at that moment, was likely in a state of dissociation, where the pain was so overwhelming that he disconnected from it to carry out his final actions. The decision to die, paradoxically, can bring a sense of peace and control that life did not offer, and this peace can be mistaken for happiness by outside observers. The dark lesson here is that we cannot trust our eyes to measure someone's pain. Depression doesn't have a face. It can be the colleague who makes jokes at the office, the friend who organizes parties, or the rock icon who smiles for the camera. The facade of normalcy is the perfect camouflage for the most dangerous predator of all, one's own mind. Chester's story forces us to look beyond the surface, to ask deeper questions, and to understand that the moments of greatest silence may, in fact, be the loudest screams. Chester Bennington's legacy is painfully dual. On one hand, we have the music, a body of work that gave a voice to millions and validated the struggle with mental health in a way few arts have managed. He turned his pain into a beacon, and that beacon will continue to guide people out of darkness for generations. He taught us that we are not alone in our internal battles, that confusion, anger, and sadness are legitimate human experiences. This part of his legacy is an undeniable gift, an act of generosity born from suffering. On the other hand, his death is a legacy of warning. It is the brutal demonstration that love, success, wealth, and fame are powerless against a mental illness, not properly treated at its roots. His story is the ultimate proof that childhood trauma, if not confronted and processed, will continue to exact its price, no matter how successful adult life appears to be. Chester's death was not a failure on his part, but a collective failure. To understand the depth and tenacity of these early wounds, he forces us to confront the reality that mental health is not a matter of willpower. The most important psychological lesson we can draw is that of vigilance and understanding. His story dismantles the myth of the tortured artist as something romantic. There's nothing beautiful about a pain that leads to death. The inspiration he provided should never have come at such a high cost. We must learn to separate the art from the illness, to appreciate the creativity without fetishizing the suffering. That fuels it. Chester's work should inspire us not to seek pain as a source of creativity, but to seek healing so that creativity can flourish from a place of health, not despair. The analysis of his life through the lens of dark psychology is not to judge or exploit, but to learn. We learn about the manipulative mechanisms of trauma, about how addiction offers a false promise of control, about how charisma can be a shield for vulnerability, and about how depression can use a smile as its most effective mask. These are not just abstract concepts. They are the forces that shaped and ultimately broke a remarkable human being. Understanding them is the first step toward preventing this tragedy from repeating. In the end, Chester Bennington's voice remains, but its meaning has been forever changed. It is no longer just the voice of angst, but also the voice of warning. He left us a detailed map of his own mind, a chronicle of his internal war. The greatest tribute we can pay him is not just to listen to his songs, but to hear the lesson contained in his story. The lesson that every life is precious, that invisible wounds are the most dangerous, and that the quietest goodbye is the one we must strive hardest to hear before it's too late. The human mind is the most complex battlefield that exists. Chester. Bennington's story is a dark and powerful reminder of that. If you've made it this far, it's because you understand that the truth often lives in the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe to The Truth, Dark Psychology and turn on notifications so you don't miss our future analyses. Comment below with your reflections and suggestions. Every comment, every like, helps us bring more light to these complex topics. Until next time.